discussion sections. Also less discussion section this summer. We've been doing those this whole past 12 weeks at DSSG in the summer fellowship. We wanted to have, since we had them all 6 concurrently, I know that everyone wanted to be in 6 places at once, but couldn't, so we wanted to bring that all back to you guys. So we're going to have each of the discussion section leaders give a quick report back on the salient details about their conversations, and then open it up to anyone else within the audience, kind of what they, if there's anything that you thought that also resonated with you that didn't get included. So we can start with Matt, institutionalizing what you build.
Okay.
How do you institutionalize it?
Yeah. So we had a great session about the challenge of, okay, great, we've done a project. How do we get it to actually be sustained within the organization? And we kind of broke it down into different pathways that you can take for institutionalization and big decisions that have to be made along the way. And so so that I'm not burying the lead, we found that across all of the different challenges, it seems like the biggest thing that kept coming up is actually the importance of a well-scoped project from the beginning in ensuring institutionalization at the end. Because over and over again, when we found challenges at different points along the way, we realized that the best way to prevent that particular challenge from happening was that you know that you've got that end in mind from the very beginning. You have the right stakeholders around the table, and you're working with the right people within the organization from the beginning. But one of the first big decisions that we talked about was, great, the project is finished. At the executive level, the organization has to decide whether or not they want to invest the resources in institutionalization. That either means hiring new people, or paying outside consultants to continue it, or paying for a product. And so that's a huge hurdle. And the group talked about important ways that you can help influence that decision toward institutionalization. And they're very practical. It was show how the institutionalization of the project will affect the bottom line, allow for greater savings or new revenue, will affect the quality of decision making at the executive level or on down, or frankly, it will affect the quality or quantity of the press that you get. And that, all those being important. Then you say, okay, great, we've got top-level buy-in. How do we actually work within the organization to get things to work? We had a lot of great conversation around this, and a big focus of it was if you've got an internal shop that has the capacity to do some internal R&D, right? So that was the transition path you've got. The main way that you actually get the institution to use it on the front lines is that you work to change the organization from pure consumers of the data and outputs to actual producers. That you focus on operational data users, as in the case of 311, call respondents, and in the case of Boston, working to give them the tools that they need to not just view a dashboard, but actually be able to manipulate it and ask questions themselves and become producers of new knowledge and empower them in that way. To identify data contacts or data evangelists within the organization that are going to be willing to take up the baton and help teach them to use the tools we built. And also, third, simplify the solution as much as possible. One of the examples that was brought up was a model that was built, very sophisticated, but the frontline delivery was actually just printed pieces of paper out of Excel. And that was the best delivery mechanism for the workers that were ultimately going to be using it. And then the last big category, we talked about this challenge of external to internal transition of a particular project. And that often big challenges with external to internal transition are that the reason you had an external stakeholder you worked with from the beginning was that the organization doesn't have the capacity to do that. And so if you started with an organization that doesn't have the capacity, and you try to transition it in, that hasn't changed unless you work with them actively throughout the process to do that. And you can do that by scoping projects in a way that you only are working with organizations that already have that internal capacity, or that are willing to, along the way, start to develop it. We talked about how outsourcing often delays change management because you only get the top level folks involved, and so there's a lack of institutional knowledge in guiding the project. And so when it comes to transitioning it internally, no one who's actually going to be using it even knows about it or has informed it in any way. So you need to have, from the beginning, during the scope, the right people at the table, not just the top level folks, but the folks who are actually going to be using it at the beginning. And importantly, to make training of those folks from the beginning a deliverable for the project. So those were the things we talked about for anything that for folks who were in that session that you thought was a really important insight that I didn't cover?
It was very thorough summary. And Matt's notes were on the chalkboard, so you can find them on his Instagram.
Very nice photo.
Yeah.
Okay,
Joe.
so Jen and I were in a discussion section where we were talking about basically getting your data ready for data science projects. If you want to look at the notes that we have from our session, we have the link up there, the NPO_data. And so we were taking notes. We have some links to some useful things that came up in this discussions, not only points about what's useful, but also some software that seems to address some of the things that people find challenging with doing these things. I think there's some overlap with what Matt just talked about and what we ended up talking about in our project. Now, when I went into the section, I was thinking more like just get your data into a database, maybe you get it into the right format to do the analysis, but we ended up going all the way through to the end where you do some modeling, you store the results from the modeling, because really there's a cycle when we're talking about this stuff. Your project's never really complete. You can do, you might do a decent job, but then you want to make some modifications to what you've done so far. So you can take that output, and that's going to feed back to the input at the beginning. And one of the big things that Matt kind of touched on, and we certainly did in our section, is the human element that comes into play for all of this. It takes place when you're collecting your data. The people who are collecting the data, they might not collect what you want them to collect. They might not do a good job. If you want a phone number and they don't want to deal with that, they might put 8675309, something like that. So like, how do you get the data that you want? It's not just about constraints on your database, it's also about giving them the right incentives to do that. And there are a number of ways that you can do that. For example, you might not need to collect certain fields if you're getting the same information from other fields, or you might offer them suggestions that they can just verify rather than having to put everything in themselves. Even down to talking with them, incorporating them into the process when you're designing all of this as well, so they understand why it's important to collect this data and what they're going to get out of it. So like, well, yes, if I go ahead and I collect this information, then I'm going to get like Y in return, and Y is really good for me in my job. So now I want to do that. So that would drive the whole process. I think the human element certainly plays a big role there. Sorry for not being as thorough as Matt, but we can go to our notes. Yes.
I just have Instagram.
Anyone else went to that session? Excuse me.
So if you guys want to edit the document, anybody can go in and put extra notes. But I think we kind of walk through the whole chain, like from data intake to how to take inventory of what you have, managing what you have, and then also kind of matching it up with other forces. And it's pretty long list of things to add to it if you find out.
Great, so we have neither a link or thoroughness, but we've got some nuggets. So we are the topic of our discussion session was how do you get your data science team to get good results? or the best results. And there's a few things that came out as, let's say, important topics. So the first is that first of all, while skills are very important, what is much more important, especially in a data science setting, is a sense of humility and a bias for action, because it requires sort of a go-get attitude to solve a problem. It's much more important to have that attitude than just having some experience in some specific tool. What also came up is that sometimes we get deceived by, let's say, the Ivy League type of credentials, which don't always mean that people can actually do good data science. So that's sort of a lesson learned from some of the folks in the room. Another thing which we talked about was the idea of, we kind of quickly agreed on this actually in the room, which is quite interesting, is that the idea of the importance of diversity of the team. And what we agreed on was that the more diverse teams tend to be better teams. And I think that's not specific to data science teams, it's probably true for most types of teams. But what we specifically sort of discussed was in a world where sometimes if you're hiring or looking for data scientists, you don't always have the choice between people. How do you sort of then try and maximize that diversity? With the example on the other side being DSSG, where we have 900 applicants, so we could make a choice and optimize for diversity between the teams and the applicants, or the people that we accept. That's not always the case, and people had examples where they're a startup or a research group where you're looking for data scientists, which is already hard to find in itself, because it's an employee market. Then how do you still optimize for diversity? So I don't think we really answered that, but we sort of thought about ways of making sure that we don't forget about that aspect. We also talked about what sort of tools you should be using in your data science team. In particular, because there are some people brought up the question of, well, developers have already come up with very good collaboration tools. Computer scientists have come up with good collaboration tools, but data scientists apparently haven't yet, or haven't adopted some of these tools. So how can we think about that problem in particular? The other thing was, how do we change the types of tools that we're using as a data science team over the course of the project? So typically at the beginning, when you're still doing data exploration and you're doing ingestion of the data, maybe the team ends up using a lot of notebook style tools. Whereas as you move towards sort of a more mature solution, you need to start thinking about, let's say, also more streamlined tools and also processes where you do versioning, or you've got people actually agreeing on where that their version of the code is sitting, so that the other team members can access it, and you don't have sort of IPython notebooks floating around and 32 branches in on your GitHub in a 4-person team. So that was, yeah, not speaking from experience. We also talked about the types of that skills aren't binary. So it's not like you know Python or you don't, or you know databases or you don't. It's about you know something or a little bit or very much of it, and you can always learn more. So that's sort of an important thing for a data scientist to realize on the team, because a lot of us have, let's say, identities that are associated with tools or with a field, like being a statistician or a machine learning person or an economist. But really, we all know a little bit about everything, a little bit more about some things than others, but as long as we recognize that, we can sort of make progress. And also, I think the last point here is we talked about how you actually go about hiring and applying for jobs as a data scientist. And some of the takeaways there were that often there's a mismatch in what really the company thinks a data scientist is and what the individual thinks they are as a data scientist. And so how you can sort of get across that, and a key takeaway there was that actually it's much easier to, when you're looking for a data scientist, describe what you want that person to do, as opposed to putting out a job application that says, I want that person to know Excel, or I want them to know Python. But describe what the task is that you want that team or that person on that team to perform. Emily, anything else? Did I keep me honest? Anything I missed? Okay, anybody else, anything? Alright, great, approval. I was thorough. No leak, next time.
Yeah, you?
No, you go. No, you hang up.
All right. I was the stakeholder and team management discussion section. And so I think both Matt and Joe kind of touched on stakeholders and relationship management coming up in all these other areas that doing data science for social good is inherently human, and the humans are an important factor of that, whether they are stakeholders or the people represented in your data or whatever. I like to say often that we care about anything, even if it's pipes, because it affects people. So a lot of what we talked about was stakeholders, whether they're internal or external to your team or like a partner that you're working with. In general, if you start from defining the goal and everyone's on board that the goal that you're trying to achieve is the right goal, then as things get difficult later, which they will because you're dealing with people, that you just need to call back and say, here's what the goal was, we're all trying to work on the same thing. It's much harder to say no when you've agreed that the goal is the right thing to be doing, and to kind of remind people of that. And we talked a lot about transitions in a lot of cases and how to help people, especially in teams that are maybe student-based, where you have people shifting a lot, talking about documentation, being able to say, here's the process. You don't need to go reinvent it every time, or you don't need to rediscover it every time, because it's documented. I don't know, Lizzie, any other insights? Anyone else?
Goodwill projects. Goodwill projects.
Goodwill projects.
Where you'll do something that you don't think is important just because you know that it will make the stakeholder buy in. They'll look at it and they'll say, wow.
Yeah, so there's a lot of there's a lot both of doing a small project to prove that it is feasible and something can be done and value can come out, as well as that thing of just starting from the places where people agree that it's a problem rather than trying to have to go in and convince them that there's a problem that exists. Yep, I also remembered during the session that I have a Facebook group on data science for good, that part of this discussion was, hey, is there a catalog of some of these things that other people are doing, or tools that they're using, or processes that we can kind of share some of this knowledge? And I think What Works Cities is starting to do some of this, has some catalogs there, but also just building this network so that some of this community can continue on post this particular conference, that you have that space to kind of come in and ask questions and see what other people have done. So hopefully that's a useful tool post-conference.
Where do we find that?
It's on Facebook. It's just called Data Science for Good. It's a closed group specifically so that we can have like
just found it.
reasonable conversations, but if not, I'll send out a link.
Got an alert. Sam was asking to join the group.
And we took, Laura from NYU took notes, but I don't know if they're posted anywhere yet, so we'll get those posted later.
I'm getting there.
It's me, I guess. Hi, yes. So I'm Rob. I co-led the ethics of data science discussion with Bill Howe. Because it was an ethics discussion, we started with a lot of questions and ended with more questions. So I'm not sure what sort of conclusive statements I have to make. We did end on, or pretty close to the end, we got to self-driving cars and the trolley problem. So to consider that a successful ethics. A couple of the specific issues we talked about was how you establish trust with your partner as a data scientist working with a government agency or an organization, specifically around trust that they will actually do with your work what they say they're going to do and not use it for some other use that you would not be comfortable with. it's a tough thing to sort of codify or to come up with a set of standards for, we sort of determined, but it did kind of circle back to the idea of project scoping, which has been a recurring theme I know of the week, and using your best sense about a partner as early as possible to sort of like shake these ethical questions out as early as possible in the process. That sort of bloomed into a broader conversation of unintended consequences of your work, which is another tricky issue with no real good answer, like what should you do about that? It included not just partners misusing the work, but also just partners perhaps totally innocently misinterpreting the work, putting too much causal, believing that feature importance is equivalent to causality, and maybe designing an intervention that does more harm than good, or goes in a totally different direction than you intended. Again, no easy answers. Sort of where we came around to was that there needs to be some sort of ethical framework for data science projects that could borrow from some of the different scientific disciplines and what they've come up with around ethical frameworks, but none of them ported over exactly like one-to-one. Because of how we've been talking about the last 2 days, the data science is not just research, but research that is intended to motivate action. So things like an external review board, an IRB that work in other disciplines to some extent, may not fit data science very well because, as someone said, they're looking for a large amount of harm to a small group of people, whereas when things go wrong in data science, it can cause just a little bit of harm, but to a lot of people in some cases. So kind of coming up, we sort of circled around like, where can we find this? A couple organizations were brought up as doing a good job of this. Data and Society was one. Planet Labs and the external review process they've set up. Basically, it came around to just sort of how can we come up with this idea of this ethical framework? What would it look like for somebody to be like a data ethicist or techno-ethicist in the same way that you now have bioethicists that think about a lot of these hard issues in medical and biological research? And my own personal conclusion was that, like, we, the people in this room, could probably do it better than anybody else. So, I didn't put my notes up anywhere, but if somehow this turns into a group of people that can start thinking about this question, I think that'd be a great outcome from this conference. Did anybody want to add something from our group that I might have missed?
You mentioned a couple of I may have missed organizations that are doing good work, and you cited their names. Can you repeat that a little bit?
Yeah, Data and Society was one that was brought up, as that publishes, I think, a lot of articles on this.
Okay.
And then Planet Labs was actually a group that does satellite imagery, and they were brought up as a model of how to create sort of an external review process to make sure that they are doing ethical work. Thanks.
Hey everyone, my name is Chad. I was one of the project managers this summer. I co-led the replicability and use case discussion with James Wiseman, who could not be at this particular session. Jane went over sort of different definitions of replicability with the group. She used the analogy of like baking a cake exactly direction by direction as someone else who baked a cake that was really tasty. Mike from Ohio, when asked if that was replicability, Mike from Ohio replied, "Did it taste good?" Which made a pretty good point about like the outcome is really what matters. I think the outcome for the person who's ultimately using it. Then we tried to get into the mechanics of like how do you promote replicability. I don't know that we really came to any conclusions, but I'll leave you with the questions that were asked. Can you get organizations excited to be second? What should I do the first time to help with replicability in the future? How to replicate if I don't have all the same ingredients as originator? Specific example was like I only have 7 of the 10 features that the previous group had. How important is communications and promotion? How do you sell it to follow-up organizations? Do you start with one organization and then go from there, or do you try and do it with a group group of 5, let's say, and then use that to expand even further? How do you balance the ease of a problem versus the importance and impact of the problem you're solving? And then is replication the same as scalability, which I think we said there was a difference. And then I think the one last takeaway that I think there was consensus on was that Jane mentioned research that the most successful replication is when like one of the originators was part of consulting on the replication. And so that was something that like kind of bothered us because it meant that like it implies that the originator is sort of crucial to successful replication. So I don't know that we all agreed with that necessarily, but that was something that we thought had to be considered. So
Was that specific to, because I don't know it, these things have never been replicated, right? So was that specific to data science and sort of government and nonprofits, or was it just more abstractly
yeah, it was
applicable?
more from her lens as the Harvard Innovation Awards. So the Harvard Kennedy School of, yeah, so that's like not data science specific, it's broader than government innovation. Yeah.
Could you list out those questions again?
Good. Or you could send
We're
them.
gonna hopefully post all of these to somewhere. Which will be
I could
linked,
also
so,
like after
yeah.
this, show you my.
Which will be linked to the conference website. Same for all the training workshop presentations. In all our free time tomorrow, we're gonna
Okay.
put all those up, so.
Any,
can you-
anything else from that session?
I'd like to hear more, particularly about the question of what to do the first time in order to make results. Like, did you guys have any discussion around that?
We honestly didn't, we wish we had another hour, to be honest, to discuss, but I think we all know that like toolkits are helpful, and like thinking about that toolkit on the front end is important, but we also like know that the people aspect is really crucial too. That's sort of where the originator concept came in. Like there's tribal or tacit knowledge that the first person has that did it, and how do you like effectively capture that in a way? We really didn't have an answer for that other than can they, you know, you have to converse with them. I mean, I use my own example of like having done CityStat in Baltimore and then launched the same office in Cincinnati, but part of that was like I know the folks who started the Baltimore office, was able to call them. So even though I wasn't an originator, I had access to the originator, and how that was probably important to success. So.
There was that in our group, someone brought up an interesting example of this that I thought was really interesting, which is internal replicability. In Boston, they will often do the first version of a project as the person will pitch, I want to do this pilot, I want to create a little prototype. And then if it goes well, they'll do the whole thing over again, but with the intent of institutionalizing it, of saying, okay, this is now going to become a data product that we use in this particular. And so we talked about what helps in that setting, and one of the big things obviously is documentation, right, that the person writes it down on the way.
But I mean, the challenge is, so if you know when you're doing it the first time that it's gonna be a successful thing that people will want to replicate, then the first time is very different. But in 90% of these projects, you don't start by, you can assume that, but it's a bad assumption, like most of them will. So because you don't know that in the first time around, you can't plan for replication because it's a lot of overhead. So the question is, do you take on that overhead and say, well, that's the price I have to pay, because what if it's successful and people want to replicate it? Or do you just do the first time as if I just need to prove, there's a proof of concept that shows that this is doable, and then scrap all the code, all the infrastructure, everything, and then think about how do you replicate it and build it? Because I think that's more like, what do you do the second time? The first time, you do what needs to be done because it needs to work. Second time is, oh, it looks like it's replicable, successful. What do we build then that then can go to third, fourth, fifth? So like, that's what, at least how we've done a lot of our projects, is the first time is really put it together and hack it together. Second time, like this year we did that with Charlotte, Mecklenburg was first year, we replicated that with Nashville, we kind of scrapped everything from before and said, okay, second time means we should really architect it in a way that's going to need to be skilled.
And I would say,
The software axiom for that is build one and throw away.
yeah, and I think to that extent, particularly in data science, because so much of it is about learning and iteration up front that first time. Maybe it's not documenting everything if you're planning on throwing it away, but at least when you're making decisions, which you're making at every step, trying to document those decisions you made and why you made them, because even if it doesn't work, then at least you're not making that same decision the next time through. Or if it did work, you're like, why did we look at parcel ID instead of address level? Like having some documentation around that, not necessarily like, what did we build, but like why?
Sort of more like logging the scientific process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, 'cause I was thinking of that as an analog, is like, at least in other, well, not claim to be a scientist, but I think most of the time when you're designing an experiment, like you do bake in replicability, because you'll never be able to conclude anything valid if it can't be easily reproduced by others. But of course, like data science is like not really, like there's not a perfect correlation there. Actually.
Funny, it came up in the team's discussion as well, where the question was asked, does a team that needs to do something for the first time around versus the second time around, does that need to be a different team? And I think the feeling was, yes, it needs to be a different team, because you need to, well, you know, at least some skill sets will need to be different. So definitely, because definitely the approach sounds different, right? So,
Yeah, and like we talked about how some people are maybe better at the first time and thinking creatively and like
right.
maybe hacking the stuff together, and other people might be better at like going through and like re-looking at that logic and like building something long term.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming.
5 o'clock. So I think you guys should just wrap up and
Yeah.
send people over to where they need to go.
Yeah, hopefully everyone had a good time, maybe learned something, hopefully met someone new, or yeah, got some new ideas germinating in your brains. If you're not too tired after 2 days of conference, we invite you all back to the DSSG 2016 offices at 14 East Jackson on the 17th floor. We'll have some drinks and fun times there for everyone. Maybe karaoke.
Maybe karaoke, yeah.
And if you have any feedback on how the conference went, obviously first time doing it, yeah, we'll send out a survey. Yeah, okay. We'll have a lot of free time tomorrow, so we'll just, yeah. And we would love to have any feedback, yeah, or talk to one of us, send me an email, fill out the survey, come back next year.
Yeah. I really want to thank Jane for, she took this on in her as her project, and she's been done an amazing job. So thank you, Jane. See you guys soon at the happy hour.